Hello and welcome to BharatShakti.in. I'm Brigadier Chatterjee, editor BharatShakti.in. Today we'll be talking about operations in the Vavunia sector of Sri Lanka by the Indian peacekeeping force. I have said so before, and I would like to restate it once again, that the Indian peacekeeping force, the casualties that we had over there, those who died over there, have not got the kind of homage that we pay for our soldiers who have died in other theaters. So this particular series is an attempt to again rekindle their memories in our mind. To give you an idea about the series, it's a series with about 6 to 7 episodes. We've already run 2 of them. The first one was with General Talkat as an opening episode, and the second one was about Jaffna. Today we are going to be talking about Vavunia. Let me introduce the guests that I have with me today. First and foremost, I have with me Lieutenant General Ata Hasnain. General Ata Hasnain, a very reputed soldier. He's commanded the Srinagar 15 Corps. He's also Chancellor of the Central University in Kashmir and a member of the NDMA. Welcome, General. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Right. The other guest that I have is Colonel R.S. Sidhu. He's been a participant in Pawan as a company commander with 15 mech infantry. In fact, he is one of those officers who's fought in every sector in Sri Lanka, perhaps. Thereafter, of course, he commanded 12 mech, a very reputed battalion, which was 8 paras earlier, and then 16 MAR, and finally became a mechanized battalion. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, sir.
All right. The last man I welcome is Brigadier XP Adrian Waller. He's an Armored Corps officer, and he was the BM of 7 Infantry Brigade, and I think lasted almost the entire IPKF tenure over there. Welcome, Brigadier Adrian Waller.
Thank you.
Right, let's get down to the questions, and my first question is to you, Colonel Sidhu. You participated, of course, there. You have a great idea about all the sectors in Sri Lanka, wherever the IPKF fought. What I want to know from you is, by about October 1987, 54 Infantry Div had broken the back of the LTTE in Jaffna. There are other formations also being simultaneously inducted. This thing called peacekeeping had lost its relevance by then. I would call it more full-fledged military intervention by then. Now, what I want you to know from you is the broad deployment of Indian forces, not keeping the time frame of their induction in mind, and how were they located for these operations all over Sri Lanka?
Okay. So, firstly, when the IPKF inducted at the end of July 87, the 54 Infantry Division was inducted into Sri Lanka with a bias more towards the Jaffna Peninsula in the northern province than in the eastern province, because there were 2 brigades deployed in the Jaffna Peninsula, and 1 brigade, that is 76th Brigade, was deployed in the Batiklova Trincomalee sector with a battalion at Trincomalee and the balance of the brigade in Batiklova, Ampara, Akrai Patu, and that general areas. So it was around end August and beginning September that the realization dawned that the LTTE is playing truant as far as surrendering the weapons is concerned, and the possibility of its reneging on its commitments to the accord started entering the considerations of the Indian decision makers. There was also the issue of communal riots taking place in Trincomalee, and that stressed the IPKF resources, because the Sri Lankan armed forces were wanting to intervene in Trincomalee in case the riots are not controlled, and there was only 1 infantry battalion which is looking after that area. So, under the Deputy GOC, ad hoc sector headquarters was created in Trincomalee. I was also associated with the staff in that sector. So once the decision was taken to carry out a more forceful operation, then 36th Infantry Division was inducted into Trincomalee, and the operations against the LTTE commenced in October in the near simultaneous time frame. So, in fact, I handed over the sector headquarters and the operational details to 36th Infantry Division before moving with my Mech Infantry Company to Jaffna for the operations. Once the operations in Jaffna, that is the intense operations, were over, sometime in December, there was another review which was undertaken, wherein the additional forces which had been inducted into Jaffna, they were being reorbited under the parent formations. So this is also the time when 54 Infantry Division was looking after only the Jaffna Peninsula. 36 Infantry Division was nominated for Trincomalee, and two additional formations, that is the 4 Infantry Division in Vavunia and 57 Mountain Division in Battalion, were inducted. As far as 4 Infantry Division is concerned, most of its formations had earlier already been deployed in Jaffna, and they were already brought down this thing by end December and beginning of January into the Vavunia sector. And it so happened that I was the one who was, by the time, along with my company and the battalion headquarters, had moved to Vavunia and escorted the headquarters 4 Infantry Division to Vavunia. So this is how the broad deployment existed in February 1988.
Right, thank you. I have a follow-up question thereafter. Now we'll focus primarily on Bavunia. And you said 4 Infantry Div was the one which went into operations in Bavunia. What I'm interested in is how was the mix of populace, mix of Sinhala, mix of let's say Tamils over there, and what is the kind of terrain topography that you encountered in the Bavunia region?
It's a very relevant input for the deployment of the armed forces in Operation Pavan. So, as far as Vavunia is concerned, it had roughly around 90% odd Tamil this thing Hindus, around correction 82 odd percent, around 10% were Sinhalas, and 7 to 8% roughly were the Tamil moods. Now the Sinhalese, they were more concentrated towards the eastern and the southeastern part of Vavunia, whereas the Moors were predominantly concentrated towards the Manar Peninsula. Uh, as far as the Vavunia sector is concerned, it comprised of the districts of Kilinochi, which was just south of the Elephant Pass, thereafter Malaitivu towards the coastal side, and Vavunia towards the southern side, with Manar being to the left. Manar's importance was that it was the closest to the across the Park Strait to the Indian hinterland. The entire area was dense jungles, and the move of troops off the roads and tracks was very difficult. Water was also an issue. So, as far as the military operations were concerned, uh, they were primarily dependent for their logistics, which had to be drawn in from Trincomalee, because there was no viable jetty or a port which existed in the Vavunia sector. Whereas in 54 Infantry Division, the KKS jetty was able to meet most of their logistics requirements. Trincomalee was the major port, so there was no issue as far as logistics supplies to 36 was concerned. Batiklova did have a minor jetty, and some of its balance of its requirements were met from Trincomalee. As far as 4 Infantry Division was concerned, it was totally dependent on Trincomalee and to a little bit on the airfield which existed in Vavunia.
Right. Before we go into operational aspects, one last question. What was the importance of Babunia in the overall scheme of IPKF's, let's say, operations?
You see, apart from the terrain considerations, there was also the issue of the move of the LTT hierarchy into the jungles of Mullaitivu and Kilinochi. So, with them being bottled up, it became difficult for the LTT hierarchy to be in effective communication with their military resources in the eastern province, that is in Trincomalee and in Batiklova. The second aspect was that Vavunia also guarded the approaches into the Jaffna peninsula as well as Vavunia. So, with the deployment of the division along these axes, the effective move of major reinforcements and troops and weapons and equipment between the eastern province and the northern province was impacted. Also, as far as the Sri Lankan Army is concerned, there was always an uncertainty about the attitude of the younger distinct officers and the troops, and the issue of their interference at any point of time had to be negated. So, with the deployment in Vavunia, even that aspect was looked into, because as long as Vavunia was effectively monitored, neither the LTT nor the Sri Lankan Army could impact the IPKF operations in the Jaffna
Thank you.
Peninsula, which comprised almost 40% of the Tamil population.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that's a very fine explanation. Let us go a little further and let me get on to operations per se. And let me get on to you, Brigadier Adrian. You were there as the BM over there, one of the youngest BMs, I think, that the Sri Lankan operations saw. You went just after your staff college for being a BM there. I remember seeing you off as a captain from staff college, and then you land up there and become a major. Well, how was the div organized a little bit? I mean, in terms of its OBAT, just give us the major things, like what were the infantry brigades, and thereafter, of course, if you had any major component of armor or artillery with there with you, and let's get on to 7 Brigade thereafter.
Okay. Firstly, I'll give a brief overview of the problem, very briefly. The Sri Lanka Accord was signed on 29th July 1987 between the Srinagar, Tamil and Indian governments. There were arguably 80,000 to 100,000 Indian troops in IPKF in 4 divisions and many brigades. The last soldier left the island in March 1990. Officially, there were 1,200 killed and 3,000 wounded. This is approximate numbers. This is many more times than Kargil. It was referred to as a conflict and not a war. And because of this, soldiers who were killed or wounded there seldom got their due. Now, the organization of 4 Infantry Division. Let me remind you that this was a incremental build-up. First in Vavunia was 36 Infantry Division. And there was a lot of fluidity in affiliations of divisions, brigades, and battalions. Battalions were re-affiliated with almost monotonous regularity, and I suspect without too much planning. Formations and units had initially moved for IS duties, and so they had very few battalion support weapons. 4 Infantry Division had 3 brigades, of which 7 Infantry Brigade was 1. Of course, other brigades came under attachment and detachment as per the operational requirement. The division, apart from the usual attachments of a division, had with it an armored squadron, a mechanized company, though I suspect the company had the battalion headquarters also co-located, but it used to keep moving between Trinco and Vavunia. It had an artillery regiment, it had air OP elements, additional intelligence units, a signal intelligence unit. Co-located with the divisional headquarters was an airfield, Now, this airfield was the link of 4 Infantry Division with mainland. This was used by both fixed wings, including large aircraft and helicopters of the Indian Air Force.
Right. Let's go a little further. We are aware that it's a very thick jungle terrain in which your brigade was operating in Malai Tudu area, etc. So what are the typical pattern of operations of an infantry battalion? If you can explain that to us in such areas.
The brigade almost never fought as a brigade. This was the essential tasks of a brigade were really coordination and positioning of reserves. Sometimes it was coordination between battalions that came in from outside, but there was never a brigade in the accepted, a brigade attack or a brigade cordon and search in the accepted sense of the term. Excepting on one occasion when there was a casualty of a very senior officer, the CO of a unit. He was killed in action, and so the brigade operated, but it was still in a coordinating role as opposed to a direct command role. Battles were essentially company and battalion minus, sometimes 2 companies of a battalion and the battalion headquarters, or sometimes 3 companies and the battalion headquarters, but seldom more than that because troops had to be left to man the post. It was here that our troops first came under the close-range devastation of an AK-47 in the jungle, a mind-numbing fire delivered at very close range. The ancient 7.62, with which our troops were armed with at that time, was no match for the enemy's automatics ripping at about 600 rounds per minute. Until we began getting AKs through ordnance channels, units retained captured LTT weapons, which meant they did not reflect them in SITREPs. Contact with the LTT typically lasted for a few seconds or maybe a minute or a minute and a half at most. Time for the LTT to fire 2 AK magazines, run forward, grab the weapons of the leading elements of the Indian patrol, and run. Units initially had gone to Sri Lanka doing conventional warfare, or rather training for conventional warfare. And slowly they became adept at this form of hit and run fighting. Jungle bashing, as cordon and search was known, everyone sarcastically called it jungle bashing. It was patrolling, cordon and search, odd area domination, but troops that took part in this became experts in jungle warfare. I remember a CAG audit objection when he said words to the effect, "What is the need for soldiers in the IPKF to be issued an extra combat dress?" This shows the callousness and the lack of attention that was given by the general public to the IPKF at that point in time. A typical operation, the person carried his food, water, weapon, ammunition for his personal weapon, ammunition for crew-served weapons of the company or battalion, and communication. His general load was 20 or 30 kilograms. It was very slow, mind-numbing, and dense jungles, leeches, constant humidity, sores from chafing, and a false sense of nothing is happening. Thus, contact with the LTT when it came required immediate reorientation and to the direction of enemy fire. The contact was a blaze of fire lasting, as I told you earlier, a minute or so, and then came the heartbreaking business of casualty evacuation, or CAS-evac as it was known in Sri Lanka.
Right. Thank you. And well, you just pointed out the same thing. Somehow or other, this country, I think, was never really totally involved or with the troops when they were there in the IPKF operations in Sri Lanka. But let's go a little further and let's go to the other territory, that's the LTT territory. Obviously, Vavunia was very important for LTT, and Prabhakaran, in fact, spent most of his time there, I think, even after the IPKF left. Sri Lanka. Prabhakaran spent his time there, and ultimately he died there also. But General Hasnain, my question is to you. Can you give us something about the LTT's concept of operations before we go into any of ours?
Thank you very much. A pleasure being on this program. A pleasure being with Brigadier Edwinwala also, because we were in the same brigade. He was the BM and I was one of the senior most company commanders among the units. You see, he's described the operations extremely well. One or two other things which I may just supplement here, which will give you an idea about the LTT concept also, is that our operations were actually never cordon and search. They were actually search and destroy operations, what are called SADO operations. Search and destroy operations, because we normally never kept stops or large-scale cordons in any area. The second thing is that this is, in that 1 minute blaze of fire which Brigadier Edwinwala has just explained, we ought to also remember that the LTT was one of the rarest militant organizations, terrorist organizations, which actually counter-ambushed. If you managed to ambush them, they actually counter-ambushed. The size of the operating elements, you see in Kashmir and places like that, terrorists move in groups of 6, 7, 8 maximum. These days in groups of 2 to 3. The LTT rarely moved in groups of less than 15 to 20. And we operated normally in platoon size or about a company lesser platoon size. One of the major lessons I came out with from there was that in a contact, I as a company commander rarely found the occasion to use in my entire force. Because if I contacted 20, 25 militants, LTT militants, I would use that much of a force of my company lesser platoon, and the rest of the men would be waiting for orders, and those orders would never come, and the engagement would be over. The LTT was adept in using the jungles. One of the very important advantages of being in Vavunia for the LTT, or being in the Vani jungle, the main Vani jungle, very, very dense jungle around Mulaituvu, was the fact that this was closest to the coastline. Now, this afforded the supremo, Prabhakaran, to be able to make his movements along the coastline, sometimes by boat, moving out from places like Alampil or even Mulaituvu and moving up north towards Jaffna. This used to ensure that he avoided the entire ambushes, the entire deployment of the IPKF and the deployment of 4 Infantry Division in particular, the deployment of 7 Infantry Brigade completely. This was something that we realized a little later, when we realized that the location of the LTT headquarters, the main camp, which was known as the Daddy Camp, was actually just off the coastline into the Vani jungle. And the reason for it was logistics was very easy. Logistics was comparatively much simpler from the sea. And the second thing was that this was the area where they holed up with their best cadres after the defeat in Jaffna. 300 to 400 of the best cadres holed up here and actually deployed themselves in a camp with their families and everything there, almost as if they were prepared for war. And that is why when we went for a particular operation, which Brigadier Edwinwala was just describing to you, we literally ran into a battalion-sized defense, almost a battalion-sized defense there. So that was a very, very interesting operation.
Right. Like you said, General, Mulaituvu is a mix of terrain. You've got the coastal terrain, you've got the rural, semi-urban, jungle, all kinds of terrain. Now, what were the challenges for the troops of the IPKF? That's one. And if you can give me a typical example of a battalion or a brigade group operating there, how did they go about it? And we will have to go a little fast. I'm a little constrained for time.
I'll just explain this to you very, very quickly. Among the challenges that the IPKF troops, my troops in this particular case also, jungles, very thick jungles. Once you are into the jungles, logistics was a major problem. You would have to find clearings. You would actually have to blast helipads in certain cases inside the jungles for some kind of an dropping to be done by helicopters. Even for casualty evacuation, CASEVAC, as Brigadier Edwinwala said, was a major challenge. The other aspects were that the good thing which happened was that we were in about 4 to 5 point deployment at the maximum. Battalion headquarters and 4 companies in 4 different locations. Mercifully, we didn't come down to platoon deployments here and there. One of the major challenges used to be that if you moved out with a company less a platoon strength for operations, you were always worried about the platoon strength left behind in your company operating base. Because the LTTE had a habit or a methodology of actually threatening to attack or even at times actually attacking a company operating base with a sizable strength. So it was always a question of how balanced are you as a company commander. Whether you need to take more troops out into the field, into the ambushes and the search and destroy operations, or leave behind more troops for the defense and security of your perimeter as far as the company operating base was concerned. And lastly, the other challenge was the fact that we had no other means of logistics, and we had to open the road almost every 3 weeks. And this was a dicey operation because the LTT knew that this was a predictable kind of an action which would take place. And they would be always prepared for it. The use of IEDs against our vehicles and even against our foot columns was something which posed a major challenge. And this is something that we learned for the first time, perhaps. Lastly, as far as an operation was concerned, 21st, 22nd of March 1989 was a particular operation where one of the units had lost its CO in action. And by unit, along with 9 para commando, that time commando, 2 units were inducted primarily to search and destroy this camp, which was suspected to be there, and Prabhakaran was supposed to be holed up in that camp. This operation lasted for about 4 days, but we ran into one of the highest density minefields in that area, and we had a fairly large number of casualties. 9 para suffered similarly. My unit was fortunate that we had a clearing from where our casualties could be evacuated. 9 para SF had a major problem that they didn't have such a clearing, and they took a fair amount of time to actually blast a helipad. The long and short of it is that we killed a large number of LTT cadres. There was no artillery available. We had a little bit of artillery. I think a troop of light, the light regiment was there available with us, and the mortars were available with us. But unfortunately, we didn't have OPs with us. You, being a good gunner, know this fact very well that without having OPs in battle, where are you going to direct your fire? How are you going to direct your fire? And so at the end of the day, the issue was we didn't go in and finally destroy that camp. This operation was actually, Brigadier Edwin Wala would remember, was being coordinated by no less than the Vice Chief of the Army Staff, sitting in a place called Komna Malal. He had flown down from Delhi and was actually coordinating this major operation. At the end of the day, it was perhaps a political decision which led to the final decision to leave the camp as it is and withdraw, because perhaps the final elimination of the supremo would have led to some other political implications, and that was the end of this operation.
Right, 2 quick questions. The first one is to Brigadier Adrian Walla. Use of helicopters. If you can just make it bullet format, we are far behind schedule.
Okay, I will tell you in bullet format. So basically, helicopters were used for operational and for logistics purposes. For operational purposes, they were used for their primary task, that is directing artillery fire. That is, firstly, there was AeroP and there was Indian Air Force. The AeroP, that time AeroP, now Army Aviation Corps, was used for directing artillery fire. They were used for navigation in the jungle. They were used for casualty evacuation in operation. So I would call it an operational task. Whereas for logistics, they were used for casualty evacuation from bases and for supply and taking important people on leave. The Air Force helicopters were of 2 types, Mi-8 followed by Mi-17, which were used primarily for CASEVAC, also for logistics resupply and taking people on leave. Whereas the Akbar, the Mi-25, was used for its chin gun, for the rockets it could launch, and for the 250 kg bomb. Thank you.
Okay, last question, General Hasnain. Again, if you could keep it very sharp, what were the strategic gains as far as IPKF is concerned in this Vavunia operations?
You see, by deploying ourselves in Vavunia sector. One of the main gains was the fact that the Jaffna, northern Sri Lanka, the Jaffna Peninsula, the Trincomalee and the Batticaloa area were completely separated. This whole tract of territory, jungle, rural, coastal, etc., if it had not been held, you would have found the connectivity, the LTT would have had the connectivity to move up and down anywhere. So this was a very important aspect of preventing this mobility to the LTT, the ability to put together its act as a force together. They were separated completely into 4 different pockets, and therefore it was far simpler to tackle the entire LTT organization as an entity, having divided them into these penny packets. I think this was one of the very, very important aspects. The other aspect was the fact that Prabhakaran, the supremo, could not exercise his command and control the manner in which he would probably have been able to exercise. And the last part of it was that I think this is the area in which we imposed a fairly large number of casualties in the post-intense phase. Although we took a fair amount of casualties ourselves, this ensured that in the future, it actually helped the Sri Lankan Army, the SLA, subsequently in studying this entire operation, the way we conducted it, and the manner in which they ultimately launched their assault in 2009 was actually a fallout from the manner in which we conducted our operations in the years 87 to 1990.
All right, I think we'll sign off on that note. And thank you, gentlemen. Thanks a lot for sparing your time. Thank you, General Hasnain. Thank you, Brigadier Adrian Walla, and thank you, Colonel. Thank you so much for giving us the time to be here about Vavunia. And thank you, viewers. Thanks for joining us. And if you keep joining us like this, you will find interesting subjects being discussed on bharatshakti.in.